Hi, I'm Jenny Jones.
Hi, I'm Mike Sandgren.
And I'm Connie Erickson, and we all work at the Compassion Ministry at Wellspring.
Well, my title is Mission Pastor, and so part of that role is I get to lead the Compassion Ministry Department. Our mission statement is to eradicate poverty through relational ministry.
So I'm the Compassion Coordinator. I run the Well on Sundays, and then I also help run the Well Life Group on Wednesday nights. And the other part of my job is resource navigation for folks who are wanting to work on getting off the streets.
I run the food pantry. I order food. I go get the food. I stock the food, and I love giving it out on Sunday. I love my job. I love everything about it. I always have. When I first started coming to Wellspring, I would come for the sermon, the lunch downstairs, and the food bank. Eventually, I didn't need those things anymore, but I still wanted to work here because I consider this my Cheers. I wanted to go where everybody knew my name.
I think this is a job, I tell people this all the time, this is a job that I would do. Like if I was independently wealthy, I would do this. And I think my favorite part of it is relationships, is getting to know people. And I think I love the way that the Compassion Ministry is serving people's physical needs, but then is also serving their spiritual needs. And that this is one of the few places I've found where folks can come in and be themselves. And they can go to church not having taken a shower in a week and nobody cares. And they can come down here and find fellowship and still get their physical needs met.
That's what it's all about with me. I want to give them their needs. I want to give them their fresh fruit, their vegetables, their bread, everything they need, including warm coats, I'll go to the ends of the earth to get them what they need.
The Compassion Ministry has a specific strategy that we've laid out that we see as our way of alleviating poverty in our community. And so we have what we call our Sunday programming, which is our large-scale programming that happens in conjunction with our Sunday services. So that's the Well and the Wellness at the Well Clinic. And those are areas where people can go to find some immediate sustenance, to find some relief from the challenges that are associated with walking through poverty and homelessness. But in our ministry, we don't want to stop there. We have our Well Life Group, which is on Wednesday nights. We gather together to be able to go deeper into relationship with one another. And so through the depth of relationship in the life group and then the support through mentorship, we're able to walk with people into stability and into flourishing.
I want to say thank you for being a church that is fulfilling the biblical mandate of caring for the poor and the fatherless and the widows. For me personally, it's been a really amazing opportunity to have my kids in a place where they see that people are doing what the Bible says.
We have tailored all of our programming to provide for the opportunity for relationships to develop and to begin and to deepen. When we say the meal is open to everybody, no matter if you're walking in off the streets or driving up from the suburbs, we really mean that. But just know, if you join for the meal, if you come hang out with us for a Sunday, you are not taking food away from anybody. You're actually adding your presence and the opportunity for your relationship and your love into the community.
This is a really good time for me to let the people of Wellspring know how thankful and grateful that I am that you come down and give me blankets and coats and food and personal needs. I think the people of Wellspring are extremely generous. And for those of you who come down here and want to know what we need and our needs, I just want to tell you thank you from the bottom of my heart, our hearts.
Good morning. My name is Mike Sandgren. I'm the guy from the video. It's a joy to be with you this morning to talk about a value that really has existed at Wellspring since day one of us being a church plant. And it's a value that's grown over the years into the formal expression that we now call our compassion ministry. And it's also a value, as we alluded to earlier, that we have now placed as one of the pillars of the great work. And so it will be a defining characteristic of the next season of ministry that we believe God is calling us into. And that is our value for caring for the poor. And so that's what I'd like to explore together this morning. Every year, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development mandates something called the Point in Time Survey, which is a snapshot assessment of homelessness in American cities. And so once a year, over a 24-hour period, stakeholders and service providers go out into their local communities and actually count the number of people that they encounter who are experiencing homelessness. Now, the purpose of the count is to garner data about homelessness for the sake of hopefully addressing the issue where it's most felt. Each city that participates produces a report. For us, it's produced by the Metro Denver Homeless Initiative, or MDHI, and therefore the public can have a good sense of what the issue looks like on a year-to-year basis. Now, I've helped out 3 times, actually, with the Point in Time, once back in Wisconsin, and then twice in the past 2 years I've been able to help with it here in Arapahoe County, both actually helping with the count itself and then helping with the organization of the event. And what most people who are involved in the Point in Time would say is that the methodology used, it's such a quick snapshot over one day, it's really impossible to get a full picture and a full scope of the issue. And so the data that's produced is conservative at best. But nevertheless, in the Denver metro area, the Point in Time report from 2011 indicates that 3,007 people were counted, which means that at least that many people were experiencing homelessness in Denver. 5 years later, in 2016, the count totaled 3,697 people. Now, just 3 years after that, the most recent data that we have from 2019, the count totaled 5,755 people. That means that if we take the sanctuary that we have and fill every seat, we could do that 17 times and still have people left over. Now, I would argue that homelessness is one of the primary humanitarian crises in our city, our local community. Not only is it devastating to people who are left without a safe, secure place to call home, it also leads to a myriad of other complex challenges, such as the public health issue of having thousands of people living in a city without a place to bathe or to use the bathroom on a regular basis, or the burden on law enforcement when thousands of people are living without a legal place to stay at night. In the 2019 Point in Time report, the director of MDHI, Matt Meyer, he writes, "Given our region's strong economy, it must shock us into action seeing this increase in homelessness amongst our most vulnerable community members." Now, I can personally attest that so many of our leaders in our city and in our region are working hard to figure out ways to address this issue. But the question I want to put in front of us this morning is that in the face of an issue like homelessness, an issue of poverty, what is the role of the church? As we've said, one of the core pillars of the great work is for us to double down and to develop our value for care for the poor. We are committed to being a church who walks directly into the messiness and complexities of the issues that our city is facing and saying, we're here to help. We're committed to working tirelessly on behalf of the vulnerable and the outcast in our city, and that just begs the question even more. Within the scope of this work, what is it that we bring to the table? I think that our answer can be found in our gospel reading for today, which is Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 21. So if you have a Bible handy, go there with me now. It's Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 21. We began our current series by exploring God's big story, the story that the Bible tells, how the whole world has its source in God as creator, and how the whole world fell with the introduction of sin and evil, and how in response to that, God enacted a plan of redemption, and how we now await the final restoration of all things. Now, this passage marks a significant moment in that story as God's plan of redemption begins to come to a climax. Jesus is in his hometown of Nazareth and is ready to begin his ministry, a 3-year journey in which he will preach and demonstrate the ways of his kingdom. This ministry will be offensive enough to get him sentenced to death, a death from which he will ultimately be raised in order to strike the final blow to sin and evil and achieve redemption for us all. But in this moment, that's all yet to come. In this moment in God's big story, the plot is just beginning to thicken as Jesus begins his ministry. And notice the way that he does so, because he gives us our answer to the question of what we bring to the table in working to alleviate poverty. We see him attend the synagogue in Nazareth and read from the prophet Isaiah, saying that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, scholars aren't necessarily sure whether this passage was scheduled to be read that day or whether Jesus chose it himself. But what he does next is definitely unexpected. As he sits down to teach about the passage, right when he has everybody's attention fixed on him, he makes the astounding proclamation that today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. In making this statement, Jesus is saying that in his work on earth, a new chapter has begun of God's big story, the chapter in which redemption is achieved. The kingdom has arrived, and he announces it by proclaiming good news to the poor. The year of the Lord's favor has come, he says in verse 19. This statement refers to the Old Testament custom of the Jubilee, which was an event every 50 years in which debts were forgiven and slaves were set free. One commentary that I read indicated that in this passage, Jesus is taking that concept and expanding it to announce the time in history when God in sovereign grace brings freedom from the guilt and the effects of sin. And so back to our original question, what is it that the church brings to the table in working to alleviate poverty? We bring the gospel. We bring the news that God has acted in the world to redeem life in all of its dimensions. As Billy alluded to a couple of weeks ago, this redemption is holistic. It incorporates our spiritual life, our physical life, our emotional life, our relational life. And this message of holistic redemption is what is good news to the poor. To put it more pointedly, as we join shoulder to shoulder with everybody in our city who is working to lift those in poverty up into flourishing, we bring the story into which that work fits. To both the poor themselves and our partners in the cause of poverty alleviation, we bring the good news of Jesus the Redeemer, who has heard the cry of the afflicted, as Psalm 10 says, and has acted to make things right. The gospel is good news to the poor, to the prisoner, to the blind, to the oppressed, to my friends in the well who do not know where to turn to escape the trauma of extreme poverty, and to the upwards of 6,000 people who are sleeping on the streets of our city each night. It is the message that hope has arrived. And how is this hope communicated? How does this message of hope make its way from the pages of our Bible onto the streets of Inglewood? That's through us. We as the church are a people shaped by the gospel. And as such, our life, our individual lives as Christians, and our collective life as the church is also good news to the poor. The life of the church is good news to the poor. Our existence on earth ought to be cause for celebration amongst the vulnerable, the oppressed, and the marginalized in all places. The gospel is good news to the poor because it is the story of God's hope and redemption offered to a people who are desperate for that. And as a people shaped by the gospel, we in our very existence are good news to the poor. And I want to say here that it would be easy to do one of two things at this point. I think on one hand, it would be easy to begin to be critical and to point out all of the ways that the church in the past has failed, and even in the present moment continues to fail, to live a life that embodies good news to the poor. And on the other hand, I think it would also be easy to begin to be braggadocious and self-serving about touting all of the successes of the church over the years, the economic lives of the early church or the advent of the modern-day hospital. But right now, I don't necessarily want to do either of those things. Right now, I just want to say how proud I am of this church. Of course, we are not perfect, But in my staff role here, I have been able to witness the strength and the resilience of our value for caring for our neighbors in poverty, and it is truly special. It is an honor to be a part of a church that from day one of being planted, welcomed the homeless man into the community, just the original Bible study, and to be part of a church that continues to invest so much time, so much energy, so many resources into the often messy and complex work of hospitality to our neighbors in poverty. And I know that we in our life as Wellspring are good news to the poor in our local community of Inglewood. We have a friend in the Compassion Ministry who we've been able to know for the past few years and have been able to walk with him through a season of life in which he was homeless. And actually just last month, he got housed. And he came back to our Well Life group on Wednesday evenings, and we got to celebrate that with him, this momentous time in his life. And he was just reflecting on the past several years of his experiences, and he made the following statement. He said, "I don't know what the homeless community would do without Wellspring." And so I offer that to you as hopefully an encouragement to say that our labor is not in vain, that we are living a life in which people find respite and hospitality and people experience good news in our community. And I offer that also as a way to say thank you for being the type of church that's willing to embody good news to the poor. And I also want to say that I am deeply grateful to have the opportunity to help lead us into the next season of doubling down and developing this value. And so let me offer a few thoughts with regards to application. I want to explore together how we can continue to be good news to the poor, both as a community and as individuals. So let's start by asking ourselves, who are the poor? What is the nature of poverty? I think it's common to begin thinking about poverty from a material standpoint. And certainly material lack is a significant piece of the experience of poverty. And I don't want to discount that because it's such a significant piece of the feedback I get from the people I know who are walking through poverty and homelessness. I don't know where my next meal is going to come from, or I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight, or my back and my shoulders ache from carrying my stuff with me all over the place because I have to walk everywhere and I don't have anywhere to store my belongings. As I said before, I believe that homelessness is one of the primary manifestations of extreme poverty in our city, and that's centered on the material lack of a home. One guy I know once described homelessness as just trying to chill in your living room, but you don't know where your living room is. And so certainly material lack is a significant piece of the experience of poverty. And therefore, any method of poverty alleviation ought to include a proper dimension of material relief. However, I would also invite us to think a little bit more deeply about poverty. And I think that our theme of stories, the gospel story and how it's at work in the world, can help us here too. In his book, Walking with the Poor, Bryant Myers, who's a professor of transformational development at Fuller Seminary, he develops this idea of competing stories, that poverty develops from false, destructive stories that are told to a people about themselves, and that poverty alleviation then flows from the biblical story breaking into those destructive stories. Now, if that's true, we can begin to see tangibly how the story that Jesus is living in our passage is truly good news to the poor. Let me illustrate. A couple years ago, I was at the Wellspring Advent Party, and I was sitting around the bonfire outside with a couple of our friends who were homeless and who had joined us for the evening. And just through the course of our conversation, I posed the question to them, what is the hardest part about being homeless? And honestly, I expected them to answer materially. I expected them to say things like, when it's snowy like it is today, it's really hard to find shelter. Or it's really hard to figure out where I can use the bathroom safely without being scared of getting a ticket written. But after one of them thought for a little bit, he answered in this way. He said, "We're second-class citizens. That's the hardest part." And in that moment, I began to see and witness how their hardship went deeper than the material. A story had been told to them at some point, and very likely was retold to them constantly as they lived on the streets, that they and their very identity were lesser than others, that they belonged to a lower category of humanity, that they are second-class citizens. Now, if a story like that is allowed to take root in a person's heart, it can be extremely destructive and honestly quench the potential for change. Now, contrast that story with this one. up in the city, as you go north on Spear Boulevard, just before you cross over I-25 to get up into the Highlands, along the sidewalk, there's a stairway that leads down onto a hill that's set on a park that's set on a hill. A lot of you have probably driven past this stairway. Some of you may have used it. But what I would guess that a lot of folks in this room don't know about that stairway is that it is a hub for drug trafficking in our city. And people meet there to buy and to sell destructive substances. A couple of years ago, there was a young man, probably about my age, who had found himself homeless and was trapped in addiction. And he would go to that staircase to buy his substances, and then he would go off to the side, kind of in the corner where the wall that goes up to Spear and the wall that creates the stairway, there's a little tree there, and that's where he would lie and he would use in that corner. And from his vantage point as an addicted homeless man lying outside in the cold, he would see across through the windows of the luxury apartment complex that was set up against the other side of the park. And in one particular apartment, he'd be able to see the young couple that lived there, and he would witness their fights, their screaming matches, their insults, their cycles of anger. And as the brokenness of his addiction kept him there day in and day out, he would witness the parallel brokenness in the relationship of this young couple. And so what he would do as he lay in the cold, coming down off of his high, witnessing the pain of his neighbors, is he would pray for them. He would pray that the peace of God would descend on their apartment, that the Lord would bring health and understanding and warmth back into their relationship, that he would bring them from a place of brokenness into health. Now, the story that this young man was living under in these moments is the story of grace. It is the story of the gospel. It's the story that is good news to the poor. Do you see how God's redemption allowed this man to, even if only for a brief moment, transcend his own brokenness and do ministry? Can you begin to see how the gospel is the restorer of dignity and vocation and worth, regardless of a person's material situation? This is the story that has the power to lift the poor, because it's the story that contradicts all other narratives that tell people they are worthless, that they have nothing to offer, that they are nothing but a nuisance, that they are second-class citizens. It's the story that tells all people, whether they live in a mansion or under a bridge, that they have unshakable worth and they have the capacity to serve. And this is the story that defines our lives as Christians. This is the story of grace that hangs over all of us. And this is why our lives are good news to the poor. So let me offer 3 specific implications for us. First, I would encourage us to continue to engage relationally in order to offer a new story to our neighbors in poverty. As we said in the video, the mission statement of the Compassion Ministry is to eradicate poverty through relational ministry, because we believe you have to get to know a person before you can speak a new story into their life. And I would also encourage us to work together to introduce mutuality into our relationships with our neighbors in poverty as much as possible. In the Well Life Group, we have a value that we call mutual ministry, which affirms the reality that anybody sitting around the table has the capacity to both bless anybody else around the table and be blessed by anybody else around the table, no matter if they're driving up from the suburbs or walking in off the streets. Throughout the Compassion Ministry, we intentionally allow people who are living in poverty and homelessness to serve in a number of ways, because we know there's deep transformational potential within offering somebody the dignity of giving back and the dignity of serving. And so I would encourage you to consider how you can deepen your personal relationship with our guests in the Compassion Ministry. Maybe inquire about volunteer opportunities, or maybe join us at the Well Life Group, or maybe stop by at the well sometime. As we said, you are not taking anything when you do that. You are adding your presence. The offer of relationship does wonders in introducing the gospel story, a new story, into the life of people in need of it. So let's deepen our relationships in order to continue to live as good news to the poor. Second, we have to allow the hope that we offer to take on flesh. We have to continue to invest energy and resources into building a strategic array of concrete services and a specific strategy of poverty alleviation. I would encourage you to learn more about our Compassion Ministry by visiting the webpage on the website. There you can also access and download our 2018-2019 Impact Report, which gives a summary of the work that's been accomplished in the last year. And as we continue to lean into the pillar of care for the poor in the coming years as a component of the great work, I would invite you to dream with us about the future of our poverty alleviation services. This year, we have plans to expand our Wellness at the Well Clinic to begin offering primary care and foot care free of charge every week. We have a number of volunteer opportunities and needs that we need to fill before we can make that step, so I'd love to talk to anybody who's interested in learning more about serving in that capacity. We also plan to continue growing our Well Life group and our mentorship program because it's proven to be a deeply effective place to do deep relational ministry and has allowed us to walk with several of our friends in the past year from living on the streets into stability and ultimately into discipleship. If you're interested in this type of ministry, please talk to me as well. I'd love to talk more. Finally, we are in a season of discernment and prayer about how we as a church can be involved in addressing the housing crisis in our city, whether that's through stewarding our platform to catalyze initiatives outside in our community, or whether that's through getting our skin in the game right here at Wellspring. Third and finally, I would invite you to pray for us that the Spirit would guide and lead us in caring for the poor. It is highly significant that the first declaration that Jesus makes in our passage is that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because it is impossible to embody nor offer a new story to the world without the Spirit doing deep transformational work in us first. And so please continue to pray for us that we would be equipped and empowered to live the type of gospel-centered lives that are good news to the poor. As Billy said a couple weeks ago, the gospel is the great equalizer of humanity. That all people are created in God's image, that all people have fallen, and that all people have the opportunity to be redeemed and to be used by God as agents of redemption. On this side of the restoration of all things, we live in a world that oftentimes does not reflect that reality, where there are competing stories telling certain people they are greater and certain people they are lesser. And so often these stories take on flesh of their own and wind people up in extreme poverty. And so how can our lives be good news to the poor? How can we combat these destructive stories by offering the gospel into the world? We can do so by following the example set by the homeless man praying for his wealthy neighbors, and embodying more and more the true story of history, which is the story of the gospel and the story of grace. Let's pray.